People often hear the idea of eternal life and think of it as the ultimate reward, a paradise where time never runs out, where existence continues forever without end. At first, that sounds comforting. The fear of death disappears. The promise of reunion with loved ones is eternal. But once you think about it carefully, the concept of eternal life begins to unravel into something less like a blessing and more like a burden. Our lives feel meaningful precisely because they are limited. The clock is ticking, and that ticking is what gives urgency, importance, and weight to everything we do. If you knew you had infinite time ahead of you, what would truly matter? If every opportunity could be repeated forever, the urgency to act, to love, to create, to experience, all of it dissolves. Scarcity gives value. Without scarcity, meaning slips away. Philosophers have wrestled with this question for centuries. Bernard Williams, in his famous essay, The Macropolis Case, argued that immortality would eventually become unbearable. No matter how pleasurable or fulfilling a life may be, endless repetition of existence would lead to boredom so profound that it would hollow out the very sense of self. After all, what makes a good memory or an exciting plan special is its rarity. Eternal life robs every experience of that rarity. Religions often describe heaven as a place of eternal joy, but joy only makes sense when contrasted with its absence. Without sadness, joy becomes neutral. If every day is endlessly filled with bliss, bliss itself becomes meaningless. It flattens into a kind of static, eternal monotone. The human mind is not built to process infinity. We crave change, challenge, contrast. Eternal life eliminates the very conditions that make happiness possible. And then there's the psychological problem of identity. Who are you after 1,000 years, 10,000, a million? The memories that shape you today would be buried under mountains of new ones. Eventually, you wouldn't even resemble the person who once entered eternal life. You'd be a stranger to yourself. Is that really survival? Or is it just a continuation of some shell that no longer carries your essence? Even from a biological perspective, we aren't designed for permanence. Cells degrade, systems fail, and life is built on cycles of birth and death. Every ecosystem depends on turnover. Predators die, prey reproduces, resources renew. If nothing died, if life stretched on forever, the system itself would collapse. Death isn't just an ending, it's the engine that allows life to continue. Eternal life in that sense is a violation of the very structure of nature. There's also the moral issue. Many religious traditions tie eternal life to moral judgment, eternal reward, or eternal punishment. But eternity in either direction is not justice. To reward infinitely for finite acts or to punish infinitely for finite acts is absurdly disproportionate. A lifetime of good or bad cannot reasonably weigh against an eternity of consequences. If fairness means balance, eternity obliterates any sense of fairness. Yet the appeal of eternal life is deeply human. It's born from fear, fear of non-existence, fear of the unknown, fear of saying goodbye to everything we love. That fear is powerful, and it drives people to embrace the promise of eternity, even if eternity itself would erase the very things that make life beautiful. It's a solution that doesn't actually solve the problem. It only avoids it. But there's a liberating truth hidden here. If eternity is not the answer, then meaning must be found within the boundaries of a finite life. Death is not the enemy of meaning. It is the condition that makes meaning possible. Knowing that our time is short urges us to use it wisely, to savor relationships, to pursue passions, to care for the world we'll eventually leave behind. The idea of eternal life has a poetic appeal, but once unpacked, it collapses into paradox. Without limits, there is no value. Without endings, there are no stories. Life becomes meaningful, not because it lasts forever, but because it doesn't. The sunset is beautiful because it fades. The song is moving because it ends. Our existence, fragile and finite, is precisely what makes it worth living. When people hear the promise of eternal life, they rarely stop to think through what eternity actually means. Our minds are wired to deal with days, years, decades, But eternity is not just a long time. It's not even billions of years. It's endless, with no horizon, no point where it concludes. And when you stretch existence out like that, every human measure of purpose, urgency, and significance begins to dissolve. Take memory as an example. Right now, we already forget most of what happens to us. The brain holds on to fragments, and even those fade or distort. Now extend that across a span of infinite time. Every experience you've ever had would be buried under layer upon layer of new ones. The very events you thought defined your life would be swallowed in an ocean of repetition. After 1,000,000 years, would you even remember who you once were? Would the self you are today survive in any meaningful way? Some argue that eternal life wouldn't be static, that you'd keep learning, keep growing, keep expanding your horizons. But growth implies limits. Growth makes sense only because we can reach new milestones, new achievements. With no endpoint, what would growth even mean? The concept of progress loses its meaning when the journey never ends. You can climb a mountain because it has a peak, but if the climb goes on forever, the act becomes pointless. Religious traditions often paint eternity as perfection, a paradise where suffering vanishes, where every desire is fulfilled. But perfection is another concept that depends on limits. A painting is perfect because it ends at its edges. A song is perfect because it has a beginning and an end. If it looped forever, it would lose its effect. Perfection requires boundaries. Stretch it endlessly and it dissolves into monotony. Psychologists have even studied how humans respond to unlimited abundance. When given constant access to pleasure, people stop experiencing pleasure. The brain adapts, levels out, and starts seeking something else. It's why people who win the lottery often report that after the thrill fades, life feels strangely empty. Our minds need contrast, struggle and relief, pain and comfort, loss and joy. For emotions to carry weight, remove the contrast, and life becomes a flat line. Even boredom itself is a clue. Think about waiting in line for just an hour, or being stuck in traffic for a day. These are tiny, finite stretches of time, and yet boredom can feel unbearable. Now scale that up to eternity. What boredom would feel like stretched endlessly is not just unpleasant. It's impossible to endure. The human psyche is not built for infinite extension. Some thinkers have suggested that eternal life would require us to be transformed into something completely different. Beings without boredom, without the need for contrast, without the human hunger for change. But then what remains of us? If eternal life requires stripping away the very traits that make us human, then it isn't really our life continuing. It's something else entirely. And then comes the problem of relationships. Part of what makes love meaningful is that it is brief, fragile, and at risk of ending. Eternal togetherness sounds romantic, but would it stay that way? Over an infinite timeline, every bond would eventually strain, dissolve, or lose its uniqueness. The spark of reunion fades when reunion has no finality. The depth of grief is what makes love precious. Remove the possibility of loss, and love itself changes into something unfamiliar. There's also the issue of justice tied to eternal life. In many traditions, eternal life is not for everyone. It's selective, conditional, a reward for the faithful, which means billions are excluded. Some are promised eternal reward, others eternal punishment. And yet, eternal punishment is the most disproportionate idea ever conceived. To inflict infinite suffering for finite mistakes is not just unfair, it's logically incoherent. No act, however terrible, could ever justify a punishment without end. When you look at it closely, eternal life is not the solution to the problem of mortality. It's the magnification of all the things we already struggle with: boredom, identity, fairness, meaning. The fear of death tempts people into clinging to the promise, but the promise doesn't resolve the fear. It only buries it under a fantasy. The strange thing about eternal life is how appealing it sounds until you pause to examine it closely. The instinctive reaction is comfort, a reassurance that life doesn't truly end, that everything and everyone we love continues. But the comfort is superficial, because the very conditions that make love, joy, and meaning possible are destroyed by eternity itself. Think about art. A film moves us because it has an ending. A song stirs us because it plays through a sequence, building toward a conclusion. If a song repeated forever, or a movie looped endlessly, their power would collapse. They would stop being stories and become noise. Now think of life in the same way. Its beauty lies in its arc: childhood, growth, struggle, achievement, aging, farewell. Each stage matters because it cannot be repeated. Eternal life would erase the structure that makes existence a story at all. And then there's the reality of desire. Human beings are wired for novelty. We crave change, exploration, discovery, but novelty depends on limits. The thrill of a journey lies in its rarity. The excitement of a first kiss, a graduation, a wedding, the birth of a child. These moments carry weight because they happen only once. If eternity guarantees infinite opportunities, each opportunity loses its force. When everything becomes possible forever, nothing feels urgent. Even happiness, stretched forever, breaks down. Think of eating your favorite food. The first bite is delicious, the second still excites, but keep eating endlessly, and soon the very thing you loved becomes unbearable. Pleasure has value only because it has boundaries. Eternal pleasure is not pleasure at all. It's a flattening, a dullness, a state of numbness stretched across infinity. From a sociological perspective, eternal life also makes no sense. Societies work because generations pass, making room for new voices, new ideas, new growth. If no one ever died, progress would stall, traditions would harden, innovation would suffocate. Every culture that exists today is the product of countless cycles of birth and death. Eternal life would not just freeze individuals, it would freeze societies, turning history into an endless loop without renewal. The ecological side is even clearer. Nature depends on death. Plants die and nourish the soil. Animals die and feed others. Entire ecosystems rely on cycles of life and death to function. To remove death is to collapse the system itself. An eternal creature existing in a natural world would eventually become alien to it, detached from the very rhythms that make life sustainable. The problem deepens when we consider the passage of time on a cosmic scale. Stars die, galaxies collide, energy dissipates. The universe itself has an expiration date. Entropy drives everything toward eventual heat death, where no usable energy remains. If eternal life exists, what does it look like in a dead, cold universe? Endless survival, drifting in silence, without warmth, without change, without purpose. That's not paradise. That's torment stretched across infinity. Religious defenders sometimes respond by saying that eternal life is not like earthly life, that boredom, change, decay, and entropy will not exist in heaven. But that raises another question. If eternal life is stripped of everything human, as of needs, emotions, struggles, contrasts, then is it even life? Or is it a kind of static existence, an unchanging state where nothing happens and nothing matters? To call that life is misleading, is something else entirely. There's also the issue of memory and personal identity. If you live forever, your mind would eventually have to erase memories just to make room for new ones, which means the person you were in the first 100 years would be forgotten entirely. If the experiences that define you are erased, in what sense is you still living? Eternal life eventually erases the self. It becomes survival without identity. All of this points to one unsettling truth. The appeal of eternal life is not about logic or coherence. It's about fear. It's about clinging to a story that promises protection from the reality of death. But when you hold it up to the light, eternal life is not a dream. It's a nightmare, dressed as comfort. When you strip away the comforting language that surrounds it, eternal life is less a gift and more a contradiction. It's presented as the ultimate solution to human longing, yet it undermines the very conditions that make longing meaningful. If you can always have what you want, desire loses its edge. If there is no risk of loss, attachment loses its intensity. The tension that drives human life forward from between scarcity and fulfillment is dissolved, and with it goes purpose. Think about work and achievement. A project is satisfying because it can be completed. A goal is motivating because it has a finish line. Without deadlines, without the weight of time, ambition deflates. In eternity, you could postpone everything forever. Nothing would matter enough to pursue now. Eternity doesn't magnify motivation, it erodes it. Even relationships, which many people think would shine brightest in eternity, become strange under that lens. Spending time with a loved one is meaningful precisely because time runs out when the sweetness of companionship is sharpened by the knowledge that it will not last, if it could never end. The urgency to connect fades. After 1,000 years or 10,000, even the closest bonds risk turning stale. Love itself becomes a static fixture rather than a burning flame. The psychology of human beings is simply not compatible with endlessness. We are creatures of cycles. Wake and sleep, hunger and satisfaction, struggle and rest. Our minds are tuned to rhythms and contrasts. Eternal life breaks those rhythms. It offers only a horizonless stretch where cycles are flattened. That's not harmony, it's distortion. History gives us clues to how people react to abundance and permanence. Monarchs who lived in luxury often slipped into decadence, boredom, and cruelty. People with unlimited power or resources frequently report despair rather than joy. Because without limits, novelty disappears. Without novelty, curiosity dies. And without curiosity, existence becomes a cage. There's also the question of how eternal life reshapes morality. If you know your existence never ends, why act urgently? Why choose carefully? Why invest in others? Urgency is the backbone of ethics. It pushes us to decide now, to weigh consequences that actually matter within limited time. But eternity erases urgency. In a timeline with no end, every decision is trivial, every delay excusable. Morality itself begins to lose its grip. From another angle, eternal life magnifies inequality. If eternity is offered only to the faithful or to a chosen few, then the rest are condemned either to oblivion or worse, eternal punishment. And this framework is not just unjust, it's incoherent. A finite being cannot merit infinite suffering or infinite bliss. It's a mismatch of scales so extreme that it makes moral reasoning collapse. Even the idea of eternal reward is logically unstable. What does it mean to be rewarded if reward never ends? A reward has meaning because it is proportionate, because it stands in contrast to the effort or sacrifice made. Stretch it forever, and it's no longer a reward. It's a condition, a static state, a new normal that eventually erases the very notion of reward. And if we consider punishment, the problem becomes even starker. Eternal punishment is cruelty beyond comprehension. To punish endlessly for finite missteps is to abandon the very idea of justice. It's not corrective, not balanced, not purposeful. It's torment for the sake of torment. If such a system were real, it would be morally worse than anything it seeks to correct. So, eternal life, whether reward or punishment, collapses under its own weight. It's either unbearable, unjust, or meaningless. The appeal lies only in its surface comfort, not in its substance. Eternal life also raises a problem of scale that human minds can barely grasp. We live in years, decades, maybe a century if we're fortunate. Even that can feel long when we reflect on the weight of memory. Now stretch that across not just thousands, but billions of years, and then multiply it again, endlessly. Trying to comprehend that kind of timeline makes the human sense of purpose dissolve into dust, because our actions, our choices, our struggles all gain meaning from the frame they exist within. Take away the frame and what's left is an infinite stretch where everything blends together. This is why philosophers often point out that eternal life would inevitably end in boredom. Not boredom in the casual sense, but boredom so deep that it undermines the very possibility of desire. If you've done everything that can be done, seen everything that can be seen, and lived through every possible variation of existence, what remains? The concept of new vanishes. Novelty itself becomes extinct. In eternity, even paradise becomes routine. Some argue that perhaps eternal life would offer constant newness, an infinite unfolding of possibilities. But possibility itself depends on contrast. You can only experience something as new if it stands against what is familiar. If eternity supplies an endless stream of novelty, then novelty itself ceases to matter. A never-ending banquet of experiences doesn't fulfill desire, it dissolves it. The human spirit thrives on challenge. We value achievements that cost us effort. We treasure relationships because they risk loss. We savor beauty because it doesn't last. Eternal life eliminates these dynamics. It promises security, permanence, stability, but those very promises hollow out the essence of human experience. Stability without risk is not fulfillment. It's stagnation. Even religions that try to describe eternal life as dynamic, filled with purpose, struggle with the details. What exactly are people supposed to do forever? Worship without end? Sing praises eternally? The more you think about it, the more it sounds less like a gift and more like an assignment with no deadline. An existence without variation is indistinguishable from punishment. There's also the impact of eternal life on personal identity. If you truly never die, your identity must stretch to absorb infinite time, but the self is already fragile. Memory fades, personality shifts, values evolve. After centuries, you would be unrecognizable even to yourself. After millennia, you would be a stranger. After an eternity, what continuity could possibly remain? The you that entered eternal life would vanish long before eternity itself ended. Except eternity never ends. This reveals the paradox at the heart of the promise. Eternal life is supposed to protect your identity from death, but in practice, it erodes identity even more completely. Death is an ending, finite, sharp, absolute. Eternal life is a slow dissolution of the self into infinity, until nothing remains but an empty continuity without substance. And consider the cosmic perspective again. Our planet, our sun, our galaxy, all have lifespans. Stars burn out, planets are destroyed, galaxies merge and collapse. The universe itself may end in heat death or some other fate. In that context, what does eternal life even mean? To exist forever in a universe where everything else ends is not paradise. It's exile. It's endless survival in a cosmos where meaning itself evaporates. The truth is that the desire for eternal life doesn't come from logic. It comes from fear, the fear of ceasing, the fear of goodbye, the fear of stepping into nothingness. That fear is natural, but the story we tell ourselves to silence that fear, the story of eternal life, is not just unrealistic, it's incoherent. One of the less discussed problems with eternal life is how it undermines gratitude. Gratitude exists because we recognize that what we have is temporary. The sweetness of a moment, the warmth of a friendship, the beauty of a sunset, these touch us because they slip away. They remind us that life is fleeting, that we must notice and cherish what is here now. If life stretched endlessly, gratitude would lose its footing. Why be grateful for something you can experience a million times more? Why savor a moment if you can repeat it forever? This also changes how we understand risk. Every choice we make carries weight because it is limited. If you fail today, you may not get another chance. If you succeed today, the moment may never return. This is what gives life urgency. In eternal life, risk disappears. You can delay indefinitely, retry endlessly, or undo failures across infinite time. But when risk disappears, so does courage. Acts of bravery lose their meaning if the stakes are erased. Think about creativity. An artist struggles to produce something unique, knowing time is short. Writers race against their own mortality to finish books. Musicians pour themselves into songs because they know they will not last forever. Creativity flourishes under pressure. Eternal life would remove that pressure, and with it, the fire that drives art with infinite time. Why create today when you can always create tomorrow? And if tomorrow never runs out, the urgency to create dissolves. Even memory, fragile as it already is, becomes meaningless in eternity. A photograph matters because the moment is gone. A diary entry is precious because it preserves something that would otherwise be lost. But in an eternal life, nothing is truly lost. If everything can be relived endlessly, then memory becomes irrelevant. The nostalgia that shapes so much of our identity disappears because there is no finality to anchor it. Eternal life also warps justice in a subtle but devastating way. In human life, justice is tied to proportion. Punishments are measured against crimes, rewards against deeds, but eternity knows no proportion. A life of a few decades cannot reasonably balance against eternity. Yet religious systems often claim exactly that a short lifetime determines an infinite destiny. This is not just unfair, it's incoherent. The scale is broken from the start, and then consider the psychological toll of endlessness. Human beings are wired for cycles, day and night, seasons, generations. These rhythms give us a sense of order and balance. Eternity removes cycles altogether, or worse, it stretches them beyond recognition. A cycle that never ends is no longer a cycle. It's a trap. Without the relief of closure, without the renewal of endings, the mind would eventually unravel. Some might argue that in the eternal life, we would be transformed into beings capable of handling infinity. But then the question remains, if you are transformed so completely that you no longer think, feel, or perceive as a human does, in what sense are you still yourself? What exactly is being preserved? The promise of eternal life was meant to secure you against death. Yet if eternity requires erasing everything human about you, it has not preserved you, it has replaced you. There's also the haunting thought of isolation. If eternal life is granted selectively to some and not to others, then the promise is not a reunion but a separation. You might exist forever while countless others, including loved ones, do not. How could eternal joy coexist with eternal absence? If love is part of what makes us human, then an eternity without those we love is not paradise. It's loneliness magnified. And if eternal life includes everyone, then the problem shifts. A world where no one dies is a world without renewal. Without new generations, without change, existence stagnates. What starts as paradise quickly morphs into an overcrowded eternity where nothing ever truly changes. The more you follow the thread, the clearer it becomes. Eternal life is not just impractical or unlikely, it's self-defeating. It destroys the very conditions that make life meaningful. The promise of eternal life also brings us face to face with the problem of motivation. In the lives we live now, motivation comes from knowing that time is short. Deadlines exist, opportunities expire, seasons change. If you want to achieve something, you must act while you can. This pressure, though often stressful, is the very force that drives progress. Take away the limit of time, and motivation unravels. With eternity ahead of you, every project can be delayed endlessly. Urgency fades, and with it, ambition. This isn't just theory. It has parallels in the real world. People who inherit vast wealth sometimes struggle with drive because survival is no longer at stake. Students given unlimited time to finish assignments often procrastinate more than those with deadlines. Our psychology is tuned to limits. Without them, action stalls. In eternity, procrastination isn't a quirk. It becomes the default mode of existence. There's another angle to consider: suffering. In many religious systems, eternal life is described as the end of suffering. But suffering isn't just an obstacle. It shapes who we are. Struggle creates resilience. Pain deepens empathy, loss teaches us to value presence, remove all suffering, and you remove the conditions that give growth its depth. A life without struggle may sound ideal, but in reality, it erases the very process by which character is formed. Even in everyday pleasures, when contrast is everything, food tastes better when we are hungry, rest feels sweeter after exhaustion, laughter feels richer after sadness. Eternal life, by flattening contrast, makes pleasure meaningless. If joy is unbroken and endless, it no longer feels like joy. It becomes the background noise of existence, indistinguishable from nothing at all. Consider also the question of responsibility. In a finite life, responsibility weighs heavily because actions have consequences that ripple through a limited span of time. Parents care for children knowing they have only so many years to shape their lives. Leaders act knowing their decisions may outlive them but not last forever. Eternity breaks this balance. If you live forever, every decision is reversible in the long run. You could undo anything given enough time. This erodes the seriousness of moral choice. Nothing is final, so nothing truly matters. And then there is the cosmic perspective. Our species exists in a fragile window of time, on a fragile planet. We are shaped by this context, by the fact that our environment, our societies, and our bodies are temporary. Eternal life removes us from that context entirely, and the eternal being in a mortal world becomes a contradiction. What place would such a being have in nature, in history, in culture? They would stand outside of everything, unable to participate meaningfully in the rhythms of existence that give life texture. There's also the haunting possibility of repetition. If eternal life includes endless time in a finite universe, then eventually experiences would repeat, not just in similarity, but in exact detail. Every conversation, every event, every moment happening again and again across eternity. Some philosophers call this eternal recurrence. Far from being a gift, it's an existential nightmare. To live every joy and every tragedy again and again without escape is not paradise, it's entrapment. Eternal life also reshapes how we view endings. Endings give closure. They allow us to process, to reflect, to move forward. A book without a final chapter is unsatisfying. A song that never ends is noise. A life without death is not a story. It's an endless stretch without climax or resolution. Endings are not failures. They are the very points that give structure to existence. Eternal life removes that structure, leaving only an unfinished sentence stretched across infinity. When we see it clearly, the absurdity of eternal life is not subtle. It's woven into every angle: psychological, moral, cultural, cosmic. The more you think about it, the more it collapses into contradiction. Eternal life also creates a strange tension with memory and history. Our lives right now are stitched together by a limited set of memories. We forget far more than we remember, and yet those fragments give us identity. They help us understand who we are and where we came from. But in eternity, memory becomes unworkable. How do you carry billions of years of experience in one mind? Even if memory could expand forever, eventually the weight of it would crush any sense of self. And if memory is erased to make room, then the continuity of identity is lost. The person you once were would be gone, replaced by someone else who only shares your name. This makes eternal life less like survival and more like replacement. The story promises you will live forever. But what really survives? A version of you so changed by endless time that the original you is long gone. That is not immortality, it is the slow erasure of the self. Eternal life also clashes with the way cultures evolve. Cultures depend on turnover, on new generations stepping in, challenging old ways, introducing fresh ideas. Death is not just a biological fact, it's a cultural necessity. If every generation lived forever, culture would stagnate. The same voices would dominate endlessly. Innovation would wither. Eternal life would not only trap individuals, it would freeze entire societies in place. We can already see small glimpses of this problem in history. Leaders who cling to power too long often end up obstructing progress. Institutions that never adapt lose relevance. Renewal comes through endings. Without endings, the world would suffocate under its own permanence. Even from a scientific perspective, eternity makes no sense. We live in a universe governed by entropy. Everything trends toward disorder, decay, transformation. Stars burn out, galaxies collapse, elements break down. Nothing is built to last forever. To imagine eternal life is to imagine a being exempt from the very laws of the universe. That exemption doesn't resolve the problem of mortality. It detaches life from the very framework that makes it real. There's also the matter of fairness. If eternal life is promised only to some, then the system is built on exclusion. But even if eternal life were universal, it still fails. A gift loses its meaning when it is automatic, endless, and without conditions. What does it mean to be rewarded if the reward never ends? What does it mean to be punished if the punishment has no proportion? Justice collapses when eternity is the unit of measurement. Another overlooked issue is emotional endurance. Our emotions rise and fall in response to change. We feel excitement because it is brief. We feel grief because loss is real. Stretch those emotions across eternity, and they lose their intensity. Eternal happiness is indistinguishable from numbness. Eternal sadness is indistinguishable from torment. The very shape of emotional life is incompatible with infinity. This is why so many thinkers, from the philosophers to psychologists, warn that immortality is not a gift. It is a trap dressed in comforting words. The promise of eternity doesn't solve the human condition. It replaces one problem, death, with a worse one, existence without end, stripped of urgency, contrast, and meaning. What makes life precious is not its length, but its limits. The end gives the middle its weight. The fragility of life is not a flaw, it is its beauty. Eternal life denies this truth, and in doing so, it denies the very essence of what makes life worth living. At the core of the idea of eternal life is a misunderstanding of what it means to live. Living is not simply existing. To live is to move through stages, to face endings, to feel the weight of choices because they cannot be undone. Eternal life removes that structure. It offers existence without boundaries, but existence without boundaries ceases to feel like living at all. It becomes a kind of suspension, a kind of state where nothing truly begins and nothing ever truly ends. Think about the way we respond to stories. A novel or a film is powerful because it has a shape, a beginning, a middle, a conclusion. The characters change, the plot resolves, the story closes. Without an ending, the story collapses into endless wandering. No climax, no resolution, no satisfaction. Eternal life is like a story without an ending, a narrative stretched beyond recognition until the very idea of narrative falls apart. Some defenders of eternity claim that heaven or eternal life would be beyond human comprehension, that it would be so unlike our current experience that all objections fall away. But this response actually highlights the problem. If it is beyond human comprehension, then it cannot be meaningfully described. And if it cannot be described in human terms, then it cannot be desired in human terms either. It becomes an empty promise, a word without content. And notice how religions often use eternity as both reward and threat. On one side, the promise of endless joy. On the other, the threat of endless punishment. Both serve as tools of control. They prey on the deepest human fear, death, and offer a bargain that cannot be tested. No one has returned from eternity to describe it. Yet the very vagueness of the idea allows it to function as a powerful motivator. The less defined it is, the more easily it can be molded into whatever form believers need it to take. But when we step back and analyze it, the cracks are obvious. Eternal joy collapses into monotony. Eternal punishment collapses into cruelty. Eternal identity collapses into erasure. The promise fails at every level except the emotional. 1. The comfort it offers against the fear of death. And that fear is worth talking about, because the desire for eternal life is really the desire for death to be undone. It is the refusal to accept endings. But endings are not only natural, they are essential. A song is beautiful because it ends. A journey is meaningful because it concludes. A life is precious because it is finite. Remove the ending, and you do not enhance the story. You ruin it. Even psychologically, acceptance of death shapes the way we live. People who confront their mortality often report greater clarity, greater urgency, and greater appreciation for life. They take relationships more seriously, they savor ordinary experiences, they let go of trivial concerns. Eternal life, by contrast, encourages denial. It tells us not to face death, but to escape it. And in escaping it, it robs us of the very perspective that makes life rich. The absurdity of eternal life lies in this paradox. It promises to preserve what is most precious about existence, but in doing so, it destroys it. It offers a life without loss, without change, without end, but those are the very elements that make life worth living. The more carefully we look at eternal life, the more it reveals itself as an illusion built on fear. It's framed as the ultimate solution to mortality, but in truth, it's a hollow promise that collapses when tested. Eternity without death is not life extended. It's life emptied of urgency, contrast, and identity. It is the flattening of everything that makes existence meaningful. Our lives gain richness because of endings. A sunset moves us because it disappears. A conversation is memorable because it cannot be repeated in the same way. A child's first steps matter because they happen only once. If those moments stretched on forever, their weight would vanish. Death, in this sense, is not the enemy of life. It is the boundary that gives life its shape. Religions that promise eternal life play on the fear in it. They tell us that endings are too terrifying to face, that only eternity can save us. But this fear blinds us to the truth, that mortality is not a defect to be fixed, but the very condition that gives life its beauty. When we reject mortality, we reject meaning itself. It's not that people are wrong to fear death. Fear of the unknown is deeply human. But when fear drives us to cling to fantasies of eternal life, we trade reality for illusion, and worse, we trade depth for comfort. By trying to escape the finality of life, we end up imagining a state that strips life of all the qualities we love about it. The irony is that acceptance of death can be liberating. Knowing that our time is finite pushes us to value what we have. It makes love more urgent, creativity more daring, choices more serious. Mortality sharpens our focus on what matters. Eternity dulls it. Think about the world around us. Flowers bloom and wither, seasons change, stars burn and die. These cycles are not failures. They are the rhythm of existence. We are part of that rhythm. Our lives, short as they are, belong to the same pattern. To wish for eternity is to wish to step outside of the pattern that gives everything its beauty. One overlooked angle of eternal life is how it reshapes our sense of progress. Progress, by definition, depends on limits. We feel pride in milestones because they are reached within a span of time that matters. A degree is meaningful because the years of work behind it cannot be repeated endlessly. A career achievement carries weight because it's unlikely to come again. Eternal life removes this framework. With no final horizon, progress dissolves into an endless sequence of steps that never really add up to anything. Even the very notion of achievement becomes unstable. Why celebrate a victory if infinite other victories lie ahead? Why value a once-in-a-lifetime event if eternity guarantees infinite lifetimes? The scarcity that gives progress its value collapses, leaving achievement hollow. This is why thinkers like Bernard Williams insisted that immortality would eventually make even the most engaging lives unbearable. No matter how much variety, how many adventures, or how many experiences you could have, eternity guarantees eventual exhaustion. Even if the universe offered infinite novelty, the human mind would eventually tire of novelty itself. And the strange irony is that this is not a defect of human psychology. It's the essence of it. We are designed to live within cycles, to find joy in contrast, to value scarcity. These conditions aren't flaws to be fixed by eternity. They are the very structure of meaning. Another angle to explore is the economic and social dimension of eternal life. Our societies are built on generational turnover. Knowledge passes down, traditions evolve, new voices replace old ones. Death makes room for renewal. Without it, the old would dominate indefinitely. Those who came first would accumulate power, wealth, and influence without limit. New generations would be forever trapped in their shadow. Think about it. If no one died, the earliest generations would eventually control everything. Culture would fossilize, progress would stagnate, eternal life would not only distort individual meaning, it would break society itself. Even in fiction, when authors imagine immortals, they often portray them as detached, cold, or alien. Vampires in literature, for example, are often cut off from humanity, unable to connect meaningfully with mortals. The pattern is consistent. The beings who live forever inevitably lose touch with what it means to live. And this raises a haunting question: would eternal life actually separate us from humanity? Would immortals, by necessity, become something else entirely, no longer human in thought, emotion, or identity? If so, then the promise of eternal life is not about preserving humanity, but abandoning it. There's also the issue of justice when tied to eternal life. Religious traditions often frame it as reward or punishment, but eternity destroys proportionality. A lifetime of good deeds cannot justify infinite reward, and a lifetime of wrongdoing, however severe, cannot justify infinite punishment. The scale is broken. Some defenders argue that eternity magnifies the importance of choice, that one lifetime of decisions determines infinite outcomes. But this argument misunderstands fairness. To punish or reward without end is not magnification. It's distortion. It turns justice into cruelty or absurdity. Even more troubling, the idea of eternal life as reward often functions as a distraction from real-world justice. If suffering now is explained away by the promise of eternal reward later, then injustice in the present is ignored. The fantasy of eternity becomes an excuse to tolerate inequality and suffering instead of confronting them. Eternal life is not just a personal illusion. It can be a social one too. From a scientific standpoint, eternal life also collides with the laws of the universe. Everything we know is finite. Stars collapse, galaxies disperse, energy dissipates. Even black holes evaporate over unimaginable spans of time. The universe itself seems to have an expiration date, whether through heat death, a big crunch, or another fate. So what would it mean for a being to survive forever in a universe where nothing else does? At best, it would mean endless existence in a cold, dark void after all stars have died. That is not paradise. It's isolation stretched across eternity. This highlights another contradiction. Eternal life is often imagined as joyful continuity, but continuity is only joyful when the environment itself supports it. Once the world itself ends, what does eternal life become? Survival without context, existence without environment, being cut off not only from humanity, but from reality itself. Eternal life also reshapes our relationship to time itself. Time as we experience it is structured by beginnings and endings. The day ends, the year ends, a life ends. These endings give us orientation. They mark where we've been and where we're going. In eternity, orientation collapses. With no endpoint, time stretches endlessly in both directions. And the concept of before and after loses its weight. And what does it mean to be 10 years older in eternity? 1,000, 1,000,000? Age itself loses meaning, and with it, the sense of growth. And without growth, existence becomes static. Eternal life doesn't actually expand human experience, it flattens it. It removes the framework that allows us to measure, reflect, and grow. This is why mortality is not simply a limit, but a structure. It shapes time into something we can live within. It gives meaning to stages of life. It turns time into a story instead of an endless desert. Ultimately, The absurdity of eternal life lies in how it misunderstands value. Value is born from limits. Scarcity gives weight to every decision, every relationship, every moment. Remove the limits, and value evaporates. To want eternal life is to want to preserve what we love. But the truth is that what we love depends on mortality. Love is precious because it risks loss. Joy is sweet because it fades. Creativity is urgent because time is short. Eternal life destroys the very conditions that make these things meaningful. And so, the promise of eternity is not really about living forever. It's about escaping the fear of endings. But when you look closely, that escape is not freedom. It's emptiness. A state where life's texture, rhythm, and meaning are erased in the name of comfort. The wiser, braver path is to accept the truth that life is fragile, fleeting, and finite, and that it is this very finitude that makes it worth living. Mortality is not a flaw in the human condition. It is the condition. It is what makes life a story rather than a suspension. When we left off, the focus was on how mortality frames life as a story. Let's press deeper into that idea. A story without an ending is not a story at all. It's a wandering thread with no conclusion, no arc, no shape. The ending doesn't just stop the story, it gives it form. It's the final punctuation that allows everything before it to matter. Eternal life, by stripping away the ending, unravels the very narrative structure that makes existence coherent. This isn't just poetic language. It's something we can see in human psychology. People need closure. Without closure, events feel unfinished, unresolved. A relationship that drifts without end often feels less meaningful than one that ends with clarity. A project without a deadline often feels less motivating than one that must be completed. Endings don't just stop things, they give them meaning. They mark transition, allow reflection, and bring satisfaction. Eternal life denies closure, leaving an endless stretch of unfinishedness. There's also the problem of accumulation. With no end to existence, experiences pile up without limit. At first, this might sound enriching. Imagine all the skills you could learn, all the places you could visit. But over an eternity, accumulation becomes meaningless. Accomplishments blur together. Memories lose their sharpness. Experiences flatten. The 1,000th victory feels no different than the first. The 1,000,000th conversation carries no more weight than the one before. Abundance without limit transforms into emptiness. This connects to a paradox about pleasure and pain. Pain gives context to pleasure. Without struggle, relief doesn't matter. Without absence, presence doesn't touch us. Eternal life, promising the erasure of pain, ends up erasing the context that makes pleasure valuable. A paradise of unending joy is indistinguishable from nothing at all. Joy requires contrast. Remove contrast, and joy vanishes into neutrality. And what about boredom? It might sound trivial compared to these larger philosophical issues, but boredom is revealing. Even now, with finite lives, we grow restless in waiting rooms and traffic during long speeches. Time stretches and becomes unbearable. Now, extend that across eternity. The prospect of unending existence isn't just monotonous, it's intolerable. And if eternal life requires transforming us into creatures incapable of boredom, then once again, the cost is our humanity. What survives eternity is not us, but some altered being stripped of human psychology. Relationships also look different in eternity. Love, as we know it, is precious because it is fragile. It carries weight because it can be lost. Eternity promises love that never ends. But in doing so, it removes the very fragility that gives love its depth. A bond that cannot be broken is no longer a bond. It's a fixture, a permanent backdrop, as taken for granted as air. Would eternal togetherness intensify love, or would it wear it down until it becomes bland familiarity? If absence is erased, longing disappears, and with it, passion. There's also the practical issue of overpopulation in a world where no one dies. Our current systems of food, energy, and space already struggle under finite lifespans. Multiply that by immortality, and the planet becomes uninhabitable. Some might argue that eternal life occurs only in some other realm, but that only highlights the vagueness of the promise. The fact that it must be removed from physical reality to make sense shows how deeply it contradicts the structure of existence. And let's not overlook the moral absurdity tied to eternal punishment. To condemn finite beings to infinite suffering is a cruelty beyond comprehension. It's not justice, it's vengeance without end. And eternal reward, stretched forever, is equally incoherent. Rewards are meaningful because they are finite recognitions of effort. Stretch them infinitely, and they lose all proportion. Both versions of eternity break the very logic of morality. So what we're left with is a paradox. Eternal life is promised as the ultimate preservation of meaning, but in practice, it annihilates meaning. It removes endings, and in doing so, it removes value. It removes loss, and in doing so, it removes love. It removes scarcity, and in doing so, it removes urgency. It doesn't protect life and hollows it out. Our lives are marked by stages, and we are children, then adolescents, then adults, then elders. Each stage has its own challenges and lessons, and part of what makes them meaningful is that they don't last. Childhood is precious because it's fleeting. Adulthood carries weight because it isn't endless. Aging matters because it leads somewhere. If we lived forever, these stages would blur together. Growth would lose direction, development would have no arc. Eternal life doesn't preserve human growth. It freezes it into endless suspension. Take learning as an example. Right now, knowledge is valuable because it's limited. We strive to learn while we can, knowing our time is short. But in eternity, there's no urgency to learn. You could put off understanding for centuries, millennia, because time has no grip. And when urgency disappears, curiosity withers. The hunger to know is sharpened by scarcity. Eternal time dulls it into indifference. And think about regret. Regret hurts, but it also motivates change. It teaches us to value choices and to act more wisely in the future. Eternal life erodes regret, because in infinite time, every mistake can be erased, undone, forgotten. But if all mistakes can be corrected endlessly, then choices stop mattering. If nothing is final, nothing carries weight. Regret vanishes, but so does responsibility. Another angle is identity. We often think of ourselves as consistent beings, but even across a single lifetime, our identities shift dramatically. Who we were at 10 is not who we are at 20. Who we are at 50 will not be who we are at 80. Memory ties these selves together loosely, but continuity is fragile. Now stretch that across eternity. Identities would pile up endlessly until the person you once were is unrecognizable. Eternal life doesn't secure identity, it dissolves it. What survives is not a self, but a blur. Philosophers sometimes ask whether eternal life would even be desirable if it were possible. Bernard Williams argued that it wouldn't because the very conditions that make us human, limited time, change, contrast, are incompatible with eternity. Some defenders say eternal life could be filled with endless new projects, relationships, and discoveries. But here's the catch. Human desire itself is finite. We get full, we get tired, we get bored. To stretch desire across eternity would require changing it so completely that it wouldn't be human anymore. Eternal life would require transforming us into something else, something unrecognizable. Even culturally, the promise of eternal life often creates distortions. If life is infinite, what value do we place on justice now? Why care about the suffering of others if eternity will supposedly balance everything later? This is one way the promise of eternity can undermine compassion. It shifts attention away from the present, where real action is needed, and into an imagined future where everything will be fixed. In this sense, eternal life doesn't just distort individual meaning, it can distort social ethics. And when eternal life is framed as selective, only for the faithful, only for the chosen, it divides humanity into winners and losers of infinite fate. This creates not only fear, but hierarchy, a cosmic system of inequality that never ends. Eternal life in this framework becomes less about preserving life and more about enforcing control, a story designed to keep people in line with promises and threats stretched across infinity. Let's also touch on the problem of time itself. We measure our existence in days and years. Our milestones, our memories, our expectations all depend on a scale we can understand. But eternity shatters that scale. After 1 billion years, what does a decade mean? After 1 trillion, what does a century mean? Time itself becomes meaningless when stretched too far. And without meaningful time, there can be no meaningful life. This leads us to a final haunting thought. Eternal life is not just absurd, it's alien. It requires stripping away memory, identity, contrast, responsibility, growth, culture, justice, and time itself. What survives is not life as we know it, but something unrecognizable. The very thing people hope eternal life will preserve, their humanity, is exactly what eternal life would erase. If eternal life sounds appealing at first, it's only because the idea is rarely examined past its surface. The more closely you look, the more it unravels. Let's consider another angle: power. In our world, power is balanced, however imperfectly, by mortality. Leaders rise and fall. Dynasties collapse. New voices emerge when old ones fade. Mortality prevents any single person or group from holding power forever. But in a world of eternal life, that balance disappears. Whoever gains control first could hold it indefinitely. Over time, that power would become unshakable. Immortality, instead of bringing freedom, risks entrenching tyranny without end. This isn't just speculation. Even in our short lives, we see how difficult it is for entrenched systems of power to change. Dictators cling to their thrones, corporations resist accountability, traditions hold on long after their relevance fades. Now imagine these forces multiplied by eternity. Eternal life wouldn't free humanity. It would trap it under rulers, systems, and hierarchies that never die. And what about inequality? In a finite world, there's at least the possibility of redistribution across generations. The wealthy may pass away, and their wealth is divided, reshaped, reabsorbed into the economy. Eternal life locks inequality in place. The rich remain rich forever. The poor remain poor forever. Any imbalance at the start becomes eternal imbalance. In that sense, immortality doesn't just distort the individual experience, it distorts justice at the deepest level of society. There's also the ecological cost. We touched earlier on overpopulation, but let's push further. Our ecosystems function through cycles of birth and death. Species depend on turnover, renewal, decay. If no one died, these cycles would break. Resources would be consumed without replenishment. Balance would collapse. Eternal life is not only absurd for individuals, it's destructive for the planet itself. Now let's return to the cosmic scale. The universe operates under entropy, the gradual slide toward disorder. Stars will die, galaxies will scatter, energy will dissipate. If eternal life means persisting through all of that, what kind of existence is it really promising? To live forever is to eventually outlast the sun, the earth, the galaxy, perhaps even the universe itself. Isolated survival in a dead cosmos is not paradise. It's desolation magnified into infinity. This is where the promise of eternal life becomes most hollow. It's often portrayed as endless joy, but the reality of eternity is endless endurance. Endurance without resolution, without closure, without rest. Some might imagine it as timeless bliss, but even bliss cannot survive without contrast. The longer you stretch it, the flatter it becomes. Joy ceases to be joy when it is the only state possible. It becomes indistinguishable from nothing. And let's think about memory again. Memory is already fragile. Most of what we experience slips away. The few fragments that remain become our story, our identity, an eternal life. The flood of experiences would overwhelm even the strongest mind. To cope, memory would either have to erase itself or stretch so thin that nothing stands out. In either case, the self that entered eternity would be lost, not through death, but through dilution. Eternal life doesn't preserve identity. It erodes it more thoroughly than death ever could. Some might respond by saying that eternal life would include transformation, that we'd be given new minds, new capacities, new ways of experiencing. But again, this raises the same problem. If you are so radically changed that your psychology, your memory, your emotions, your needs are no longer human, then what exactly has been preserved? It isn't you. It's some other being with no continuity to the person you are now. Eternal life becomes not survival, but replacement. What makes all of this more striking is that mortality, the very thing eternal life is supposed to fix, is not a flaw, but a feature. Mortality provides the rhythm of existence. It makes progress meaningful. It balances power. It renews culture. It protects ecosystems. It anchors identity. Death, difficult as it is the condition that makes life possible. Without it, life collapses into absurdity. One of the most telling signs that eternal life is incoherent is how it distorts relationships. The bonds we form are powerful because they are fragile. We cling to our loved ones more tightly because we know time is short. We take photographs, write letters, share memories because we know these connections won't last forever. Mortality gives our relationships urgency and depth. Eternal life removes that urgency. If you knew you had infinite time with someone, how much less carefully would you treat each day? How much less precious would a moment feel when you had endless moments ahead? Love is shaped by risk. It's valuable precisely because it can be lost. Remove the possibility of loss, and love itself changes. It becomes a static condition, not a living bond. The spark fades when reunion is guaranteed. The intensity vanishes when absence is impossible. What begins as comfort quickly slides into stagnation. Friendship, too, depends on context. Friends grow together, share a span of life, and eventually part ways. That arc is what makes the bond meaningful. If eternal life stretched friendship across infinity, would it still be friendship, or would it become a fixture like wallpaper, always there but fading into the background? Relationships need finitude to shine. Without it, they lose their light. Another angle is grief. As painful as it is, grief deepens love. It teaches us how precious life is, how much others mean to us. It shapes memory. It refines compassion. It gives life weight. Eternal life, by erasing grief, erases these lessons. A world without grief may sound comforting, but it's also a world without perspective. Like without loss, we cannot measure love. As without endings, we cannot measure beginnings. Then there's the question of meaning itself. Meaning is never abstract. It always comes from boundaries. A marathon is meaningful because it ends at the finish line. A promise is meaningful because it can be broken. A sacrifice is meaningful because it costs something, and stretch these across eternity, and their meaning dissolves. A race with no finish is not a race. A promise that lasts forever becomes a mere condition. A sacrifice that can always be undone is not a sacrifice at all. This reveals a deeper paradox. Eternal life doesn't amplify meaning, it annihilates it. People imagine eternity as a magnifier, making love deeper, joy brighter, life richer, but the opposite is true. Eternity flattens everything. It erases contrast, erases scarcity, erases closure. In doing so, it erases meaning. Let's bring in the concept of responsibility. In a finite life, choices matter because they are limited. Every yes closes off countless other possibilities. Every no is final. That finality is what makes responsibility heavy and real. In eternity, no decision is final. Every choice can be undone, delayed, or repeated endlessly. Responsibility loses its grip. And when responsibility dissolves, morality follows. Eternal life doesn't just erase urgency, it erases accountability. Even rest depends on mortality. Rest feels good because effort ends. Sleep restores us because days are finite. Retirement matters because careers have limits. Death is the final rest, the closure that makes the struggle of living coherent. Eternal life removes that closure, leaving only unbroken effort or unbroken stasis. Neither of these is rest. Both are exhaustion disguised as survival. The cultural impact of eternal life is equally unsettling. Every culture depends on cycles of renewal. New generations reinterpret old wisdom, create new art, reshape values. If everyone lived forever, culture would stagnate. Old voices would never step aside, new ones would never take the stage. Progress would grind to a halt, tradition would fossilize. Eternal life doesn't protect culture, it suffocates it. And if eternal life were selective, granted only to some, then culture would fracture even further. A divide between the immortal and the mortal would emerge. Those left out would resent, those included would detach. The very idea of community would shatter under the weight of unequal eternity. So once again, what looks like a promise of comfort reveals itself as a source of distortion. Eternal life isn't a gift. It's a corrosion of relationships, a dilution of meaning, a distortion of justice, a suffocation of culture. It's not the perfection of life. It's the undoing of it. We've walked through the promise of eternal life from many angles, psychological, social, cultural, cosmic, and every path leads to the same conclusion. Eternal life doesn't preserve what we love about existence. It dismantles it. Think about art. Art matters because it resists time. A painting outlives its creator. A poem carries meaning across centuries. A song lingers long after the moment it was written. The beauty of art is tied to mortality. It becomes a bridge across endings. In a world where no one ever dies, where time never ends, art loses its urgency. Why paint today when you can paint tomorrow? Why write a song when eternity offers infinite chances? Creation without urgency collapses into delay, and without endings to resist, art itself becomes unnecessary. Even memory is reshaped. A photograph matters because the moment is gone. A story matters because it preserves something fragile. In eternity, no moment is gone. Every event can be revisited infinitely. But in that repetition, the sharpness fades. Memory is no longer preservation, it's redundancy. Instead of anchoring identity, eternal memory would dissolve it into a flood so vast that nothing stands out. And let's consider mortality as a teacher. It is death that teaches us humility, urgency, compassion. It is death that forces us to ask what matters most, to value the present, to love fiercely, to act responsibly. If death is removed, those lessons vanish. Eternal life doesn't just stretch existence, it hollows it out by removing the very teacher that gives existence meaning. The ultimate irony is that eternal life, imagined as the cure for fear, is actually the worst possible nightmare. It offers endlessness at the cost of everything that makes life rich. It promises continuity while erasing identity. It offers joy while erasing contrast. It promises love while erasing fragility. It pretends to preserve meaning while annihilating the very conditions that create it. The truth is that endings are not flaws in the design. They are the design. A song is beautiful because it ends. A journey is fulfilling because it concludes. A life is meaningful because it is bounded by death. Remove the end, and you don't enhance the story, you ruin it. And so, the idea of eternal life collapses under its own weight. It isn't just impractical or improbable, it's incoherent. It cannot deliver what it promises because the promise itself is self-contradictory. What makes life precious is not its duration, but its limits. Mortality is not the enemy of meaning. It is the frame that gives meaning its shape. This realization can be frightening, but it can also be freeing. If we accept that life is finite, then we are pushed to live fully, to savor the present, to love without delay, to create while we can, to care for one another knowing our time is short. The very fragility of life is what makes it urgent, precious, and beautiful. The absurdity of eternal life lies in thinking that removing death would perfect existence. The wisdom lies in recognizing that death is not a defect. It is what makes life real. The gift is not eternity. The gift is now, this moment, fleeting, fragile, irreplaceable. The gift is that it ends. And because it ends, it matters.